After weeks of speculation, the Prime Minister ditches high-speed rail to the north of England, but promises it doesn't signal the end to levelling up the UK. Welcome to Politics Scotland. Coming up on today's programme. It was a long time coming, but the Prime Minister changes track to a new priority, a northern network worth £36 billion.
The facts have changed, and the right thing to do when the facts change is to have the courage to change direction.
A former Scottish Cabinet Secretary says the delay to dualling the A9 is damaging the economy. We'll ask why the UK appears to struggle with big infrastructure projects. Hello. The Tory party faithful had been waiting for days in the converted railway station in Manchester for the HS2 announcement. Then the Prime Minister came thundering in with the news. We'll go live to Manchester in a moment. But first, our political correspondent Phil Sim will be with me in the studio throughout the programme. Good afternoon, Phil. We're in peak conference season at the moment now, of course, and I think the parties are very aware they may be needing people's votes in the future.
Yes, I think the messages we're hearing from them aren't just for the delegates in the hall, they're for the voters at home too, because these will be the last set of party conferences, we imagine, before a general election. We have a by-election tomorrow, obviously, but the general election this time next year, potentially, is what everyone seems to be building to. So we've seen Rishi Sunak today. It's kind of pivoting to a new kind of Rishi Sunak that we've seen before. He came in as the guy who was steadying the ship after the Liz Truss premiership. Now he's trying to sell himself as a bit of a change proposition, it seems. He's tearing up these old plans about the government's net zero policies, tearing up HS2. It's really kind of a bit in the mould of Boris Johnson and indeed Liz Truss before them, campaigning like an opposition to a previous Conservative government so that you can try to sell yourself as the party of change come that general election. We'll get Labour's response this weekend coming at their party conference. Very similarly, they will be pushing for change. And then, of course, the SNP, the following week with their conference. All of these parties will have very different policies, very different ideas, a very different pitch to the electorate, I imagine. But I think they are all now in that same mode of building up towards a general election in the coming year. OK, Phil,
thank you very much. Much more from you later in the programme. And of course, we'll be talking more about that by-election in Rutherglen and Hamilton West as well. But first of all, as we've been discussing so far, conference season is in full flow and the Prime Minister has been giving his keynote address to party members today. So here's the moment he confirmed the Manchester leg of HS2 will indeed be scrapped.
HS2 is the ultimate example of the old consensus. The result is a project whose costs have more than doubled, which has been repeatedly delayed, and it is not scheduled to reach here in Manchester for almost 2 decades, and for which the economic case has massively been weakened with the changes to business travel post-COVID. I say to those who backed the project in the first place, the facts have changed, and the right thing to do when the facts change is to have the courage to change direction. And so, I am ending this long-running saga. I am cancelling the rest of the HS2 project. And in its place, we will reinvest every single penny, £36 billion, in hundreds of new transport projects in the North and the Midlands across the country. This means £36 billion of investment in the projects that will make a real difference across our nation.
Well, let's stay in Manchester now and speak to our political correspondent David Porter, who's still at the Conservative Party conference. David, a very busy few days for you. We've just been hearing there about the HS2 announcement. We'd been waiting for that for a good long while. How did that feel in the hall?
Well, Andrew, it's no surprise that the announcement when it came was going to be a big one. And essentially what the Prime Minister has done is taken a scythe to a large part of Europe's biggest infrastructure project. The HS2 line from Birmingham to Manchester, that will now be scrapped. Something like 90 miles of high-speed rail going. The Prime Minister says that actually the money that will be saved from that £36 billion will be reinvested in transport projects in the Midlands and the North, and he has indicated by dint of that there will be improvements to transport in Scotland. The A77, the A75 and the A1, all mentioned by the Prime Minister in his speech as roads that could see improvements. But it would be wrong to underestimate the importance of what he has done. Essentially, he's looked at the books. He thinks that he would be throwing good money after bad if he continued with HS2 up to Manchester. So that is going. He says instead he will put the money where it can be used better and where those improvements can take place more quickly. But although it won't directly affect Scotland, the indirect effect is that if high-speed rail is not coming up to Manchester, that journeys to Scotland will not decrease as some people have been hoping. If high-speed rail had gone ahead as previously planned, it was hoped you could get to Glasgow and Edinburgh from London in something like 3 hours, 40 minutes. That will not now happen because there will not be as much high-speed rail in the UK. But the Prime Minister, very much as we heard in that clip, they're saying, look, if the facts change, you change your mind, and pragmatically you go and you make changes, albeit it will go down very badly here in Manchester and with some sections of the construction industry.
Yes, David, and we'll be getting some more political reaction to that announcement. Now, you mentioned Scotland in terms of the transport links. Anything else specific on Scotland? He did mention the union, for example.
Yes, he was, as you would expect from a leader of the Conservative and Unionist Party, very strongly supportive of the union, saying he believed the union was now stronger than it had ever been. Also some attacks on the SNP with some of the recent problems that they had. What I think struck me as well was the Prime Minister had basically said that governments had not worked in the whole of the United Kingdom for the last 30 years or so. He said there were problems with Westminster, but he extended that criticism, albeit briefly, to both Cardiff, Northern Ireland and Holyrood as well. That probably won't go down well with some MSPs.
David, of course, you mentioned that his criticism of 30 years of politics in the United Kingdom. In a sense, he was using the platform to pivot, to change, in a sense, to present himself as a change candidate for the future. How do you think that worked? How does that go down?
It's going to be a hard political sell, I think, because the Conservatives have been in power for the last 13 years. But essentially what Rishi Sunak is saying is that he is relatively fresh into the post. He's been Prime Minister for just under a year. His first job was to stabilise things. And now he basically says, look, he has been looking at the books, hence the HS2 decision. And he's been looking at the way government works throughout the United Kingdom. And he says he's not really terribly impressed with it. It was quite a detailed speech from the Prime Minister, and you're right, what he's trying to do is portray himself as the change candidate, and I think the logic that he is using there is that people say at general elections, well, it is time for a change. He will say, no, actually Labour is not the big change that people want. He, Rishi Sunak, is the change. It is a political gamble, but when your party is 15, 20 points behind in the opinion polls, you have to take political risks.
And David, you've been in and around the conference hall for the past few days. There have been some big characters appearing. Liz Truss, Suella Braverman, Nigel Farage, to name a few names. What do those characters mean, perhaps, for the future of the party, the future direction of the party?
Well, I think a lot of that, quite frankly, Andrew, will depend on the result of the general election. Very few people here, I think, as we speak at the moment, at the beginning of October 2024, think the Conservatives can get a majority. Politics at the end of the day is all about numbers. If the Conservatives go into the next general election and they lose, then there will be a battle for the soul of the Conservative Party. some of those people you've mentioned very much wanting to make it known that they would like to lead the party in the future. It was, to some extent, the beginning of a political beauty contest amongst some of those in the Conservative Party, looking ahead to next year's election, perhaps thinking what might happen, and wanting to let it be known that they would be more than willing to step up and lead the Conservative Party. Of course, before then we have a general election campaign to go, a general election itself. We don't yet know the timing of that. Most people here seem to think it'll either be May next year. If it's not May next year, well, it'll probably be October next year. But make no mistake, the election campaign is already well underway. We will see Labour and the SNP setting out their policies at conferences within the next couple of weeks. Whether that election comes in May or whether it's October or November next year, the campaigning, quite frankly, is already well underway.
That's right, David. We'll see you in Liverpool next week for Labour. Thank you very much for that. Now, 12 years ago, the Scottish Government committed to dualling 80 miles of the A9 between Perth and Inverness by 2025 at a cost of £3 billion. So far, only 2 out of the 11 sections have been completed. The man who made the commitment, the former Cabinet Secretary Alec Neil, has been giving evidence to a Holyrood committee this morning. Well, our reporter Jenny Davidson was watching that committee and she joins me now from the garden lobby at Holyrood. Jenny, this has been talked about, as I mentioned, for well over a decade. What exactly is the background to this?
Well, this goes way back to SNP manifesto commitments in 2007 and 2011, so we're talking a long time here. And then the commitment was made in December 2011. The Scottish Government published its infrastructure investment plan, and it said at that point that there would be a full upgrade of the A9 between Perth and Inverness to dual carriageway by 2025. Now, so far, as you mentioned, there hasn't been that much progress on it. We've got about 11 miles of that completed out of the roughly 80 or so that needs to be done. Earlier this year, Transport Minister Jenny Gilruth confirmed that the 2025 date wouldn't be met. She said that was unachievable. We're waiting to hear what the new timeline will be. But obviously one of the reasons for the upgrade being needed is road safety, and that's the reason the Public Petitions Committee is looking into this, because a member of the public, Laura Hansler, brought a petition about road safety on the A9, and then the committee have now upgraded this to a full inquiry. And as you say, they heard from Alec Neil, the former Cabinet Secretary for Infrastructure, today.
And Jenny, you were watching that committee. What exactly was Mr Neil saying to the committee in his return to Parliament?
Well, he certainly didn't hold back on criticising the delay, criticising his successors. The SNP MSP Fergus Ewing called Alec Neil's evidence informative, revelatory and really quite explosive, and he's a man who would know about that. Now, Alec Neil said it was extremely disappointing that the project hadn't been completed, let alone on time. He was very clear that that 2025 deadline had been given to him by experts in Transport Scotland, that he'd asked them for a realistic timeline. He hadn't just set that, and that a lot of detailed work had gone into it. It wasn't just a figure, a date that had been plucked out of thin air. There was a 4-stage process of the completion of each section and the dates that would be completed by. So there was something that could be checked. Alec Neil suggested that perhaps his successors hadn't followed up on that as well as they could. He said there had been a lack of ambition about road upgrades. He called that mind-blowing. He talked about a betrayal of the promise to the Highlands and indeed the whole of Scotland, the impact on the economy. Yes, he called the idea that date of 2025, which has recently been suggested by Transport Scotland, that it was just an aspiration. He said that was utter rubbish. So here's him replying to a question from committee convener Jackson Carlaw about whether perhaps Transport Scotland staff had been less keen on that date, less committed to a political manifesto commitment.
First thing is just to emphasise that I didn't set a date and then ask officials to give me a programme to meet that date. I asked them for the date, and I asked them that it had to be they had to be absolutely sure that physically all the work could be done as they had recommended by 2025, and the money would be there in the long-term capital programme, which the Finance Department confirmed at the time under John Swinney that it would be. So there is no question in my mind whatsoever that everybody agreed, and it was the official advice that it could be done, and each stretch could be done by the time that I laid out a minute ago. Now, obviously, when it came to the pandemic, it would be fair to accept a delay maybe of a year, maybe 18 months because of the impact of the pandemic. But until the pandemic came in 2020, there was, in my view, no excuse for having missed these deadlines.
So what happens now, Jenny? Perhaps not a lot of patience left in the Highlands and Islands for this issue. And I suppose we've got the Green SNP partnership as well, which comes into play.
Yes, there was a bit of discussion about what role the Greens might play. Obviously, they're not keen on road upgrades, but the A9 dualling project is an exemption from that Butte House agreement between the SNP and the Greens. Certainly, Alex Neil was suggesting a way forward for the committee, saying that they should try and get hold of all the papers going back to 2011 up to the present on the A9, find out where this slippage, where this delay came in, because he said he wasn't sure where that came in, wasn't aware of it before 2016, or which Transport Minister that might have come under.
Jenny Davidson in Holyrood, thank you very much for that. So there's a theme developing on the programme today. HS2 scrapped by the Prime Minister and issues remaining around dualling that major artery through Scotland. So why is it that so often these big projects do run into problems? Well, I'm now joined by Professor Gordon Masseton, Chair of Future Infrastructure at the University of Edinburgh, to give us some insight here. Professor, thank you very much for joining us. First of all, just interested in your reaction initially to what the Prime Minister has indeed announced.
Well, we know HS2 won't be completed all the way to Manchester, so it'll be HS 1.5 to Birmingham. We don't know much about the other replacement schemes for spending the money saved that have been referred to. So my first take is that it's not a good day for evidence-based decision-making. You know, we've had major projects, any projects, including the East-West Rail projects that have been talked about today, they all require detailed business cases to be prepared. HS2 is no exception. And they can take years to prepare, and the environmental, the social, the economic benefits are worked out in great detail, the disbenefits are worked out in great detail, and then a balanced view is taken on whether to proceed or not. That was all done for HS2, and it went through Parliament for approval. So to unpick a chunk of that from Birmingham to Manchester, to my mind, ought to go through a similar process to assess the benefits and the disbenefits of cancellation. Right. What's lost, what's the damage? And we've seen none of that. We're very unsighted on that.
I suppose the Prime Minister has given two significant reasons. One, the huge cost overrun, and two, post-COVID, people are travelling in very different ways. Do you accept those explanations?
Well, taking the second one first, the HS2 was never about just moving people faster. HS2 was the start of a strategic link, ultimately to Scotland, to result in modal shifts from flights to London to using the train instead, high-speed train. And also to free up the existing track for local slower services to be more frequent and have more capacity, and also transferring more freight onto rail that otherwise would be travelling by road and therefore very inefficient in terms of carbon usage. So it was it ticked a lot of boxes other than just getting people faster. And that will be lost now. The opportunity for these additional benefits on the face of it will be lost. On the cost side, mega projects have an issue, and they have it's not just a UK issue, it's worldwide. The research has shown that. Early stage estimates that are made for these very complex, very large scale, very uncertain projects, they have to be committed to go through Treasury approval at a stage when very little work by comparison has been done. Designs might be 10% complete, not 90% complete. So assessments are made for the degree of uncertainty that remains, and an estimate and a contingency is placed. But no one's smart enough to really get those right. And that repeats worldwide. It's very, very difficult to pin down a mega project that's going to last 20 years or so on the day that the first sod is cut.
So you're not saying that we have a UK issue here, because in Scotland we've had Edinburgh trams, we've had the ferries at a UK level, HS2, the Ajax fighting vehicles, money spent on procurement of helicopters, for instance. Is this common across the world, in a sense, is what you're saying?
It is, and we know about the ones that go wrong, and we don't tend to know about the ones that go pretty well. And we've had Queensferry Crossing, we've had Emirates Stadium, and projects like that have all been delivered on plan, pretty much to budget. So it's not that we can't do it, it's the uncertainty. Dealing with uncertainty is fiercely difficult. We can be more transparent about it as uncertainty materialises into issues, and go back and explain and say, this is still a strategically important project. The benefits still massively outweigh the costs in the long run. So it's still justified to carry on. It'll cost more.
So,
that's what happened with the London Olympics, for example. It was delivered successfully, but not for the price it was bid for in Singapore.
And looking at some of the perceived benefits of HS2, I mean, the Prime Minister spoke of the cost, but there is an opportunity cost, no doubt. Does the Scottish economy lose out because we're not getting that link there, maybe more freight on the roads, but also it rules out the possibility of, in the next 30 years, really any high-speed rail from Scotland to down south?
We'll need more details on that, but it does seem to point that way, that high-speed rail is now a distant prospect for connections to Glasgow and Edinburgh. One of the issues has always been that high-speed, the rolling stock, travels more slowly on conventional rail than pendolinos, which have the tilting mechanism. So to me, that suggests that it may not even be worthwhile using any of the high-speed rail track from Birmingham to London for a new journey from Glasgow to the south on the West Coast Main Line. So it may be, stuck with just the current system of 4.5-hour journeys.
Speaking from your expert view, your independent analysis of this, how does this make the UK look, do you think? How do you feel now about the UK?
Well, I mean, the thing about infrastructure and projects like HS2 potentially, and others like the Jubilee line leading into Canary Wharf, infrastructure encourages economic development and growth and pockets of success that contribute to the economy and make nice places for people to live and travel conveniently. If we've got less of that, and the right infrastructure is beneficial, then clearly we've got less of an enjoyable experience and a civilised lifestyle to enjoy. It'll be harder work. And it also makes me feel that from the UK perspective, looking out from the outside, looking in, the decision-making by government will not be looked on as favourably, because investors, and there are investors that flock around infrastructure projects, they already had been thinking that Crewe and Manchester are going to be hotspots in the future. And that's all been wiped out as far as attractiveness for inward investment is concerned. OK, well, Professor Gordon Masterton, really interesting to speak to you. Thank you very much for coming into the studio. And Phil, we'll bring you back in here on a related issue, but at quite a different topic in a sense. But in Parliament this week, they've been discussing the future of prisons and the prison estate, and part of that is about planning ahead and about infrastructure as well, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's important because of the statement we had this week from Angela Constance, the Justice Secretary, that the prison population is going up. It dropped slightly during the COVID pandemic, but it is up 600 this year so far to almost 8,000. Now, that's an issue not just because the Scottish Government would like the prison population to go down. That's why we've seen policies like presumption against short sentences. But it also raises issues with the prison estate when we're building new prisons, like the replacement for Barlinnie in Glasgow and in Inverness as well, HMP Highland, because we've heard warnings from prison warders workers' unions this week saying that the prisons as they are dangerously overcrowded. So it's something the government say they are really paying attention to, they're working on. But yeah, it does play into that wider topic of infrastructure and planning ahead for the future of services. OK, Phil, thanks very much for that. Right, we can cross live to Holyrood now to hear from some politicians who are waiting patiently. We're joined by Ben McPherson from the SNP, Liz Smith from the Conservatives and Michael Mara from the Labour Party. Good afternoon to all of you. Thank you very much for joining me. Well, first of all, to you, Ben McPherson, we've just been discussing HS2. I'm just interested, actually, in hearing your reaction to that, the Prime Minister's announcement that the Northern Leg has indeed been cancelled.
Well, I don't think it was a surprise given the speculation in recent days, unfortunately. But of course, this is a project that has already cost £100 billion with an initial costing back in 2009, as far as I can recall, of £30 billion. So a huge amount of expenditure for a very short piece of infrastructure between London and Birmingham. And I just think in terms of long-term economic planning and considerations around investment and any sense of levelling up, this is clearly a big embarrassment for the UK government. And what I think a lot of people will be asking now in the business community and of course also here in Scotland is, will that £36 billion actually be spent and spent well in the transport infrastructure of the north of England, and what will be the consequentials that the Scottish Government will receive here from that in a situation where Scotland's capital budget, of course, has been cut?
Well, first of all, Ben McPherson, you mentioned a big embarrassment, but of course, is your government not embarrassed by the ongoing cost of the two ferries being built on the Clyde, and do you not welcome indeed those Barnett consequentials from the new Northern Network, that extra money that Scotland will be getting, which could be in the region of about £3 billion?
Well, let's see if that investment comes through, and we'll all be watching that closely. I mean, in terms of infrastructure spending in general and infrastructure project management in Scotland and indeed in all honesty elsewhere in the UK, we have significantly skilled engineers and project managers, but unfortunately there are some projects that have not been delivered effectively. And look, the Scottish Government is of course disappointed about the situations with vessels 801 and 802, and a lot of effort and attention from ministerial level on downwards is going into making sure that they're delivered as cost effectively as possible in the period ahead. But also, let's remember, in the period that HS2 has not been delivered, as your previous guest was explaining to viewers, the Scottish Government has very successfully delivered the Queen's Ferry crossing, for example. So we can do infrastructure well here in Scotland. There are a couple of projects that have not been acceptable. We're working with regard to the vessels 801 and 802 to get them delivered as quickly as possible and at best value. And of course, that's also really a project management issue for Fergus Marine principally. But you know,
right. Okay.
I appreciate the challenges, but we should also remember the successes, and the Queen's Ferry crossing delivered by the Scottish Government is one of several.
Indeed, and that was mentioned. Liz Smith from the Scottish Conservative Party. We've just been hearing, as Ben McPherson was saying there from Professor Gordon Masterton, what is the evidence for this decision? It was something that was leaked before conference. It's been discussed for days. The Prime Minister announcing this huge change that will affect the UK for decades to come, not in Parliament, but on the floor of a disused railway shed in Manchester. What is going on? Where is the evidence behind this decision?
Well, I don't think the speculation has been at all helpful. I'll say that absolutely up front, and many people are going to be very disappointed by this decision. But, you know, the Prime Minister was extremely clear in his speech that there are basically two reasons why this decision has had to be taken. Firstly is that costs have been spiralling completely out of control. And the second is that in terms of the opportunity cost, he feels that more strategic infrastructure projects can be produced at the same time than would have been the case with HS2. And that includes Scotland. I think some of the very welcome announcements today are about some of the infrastructure benefits that Scotland will receive.
Now, you heard what Professor Gordon Masterson was saying. I was asking him about the future of the United Kingdom as a whole, and actually getting rid of this. There is an opportunity cost. I know your party's not that keen, perhaps, on net zero now, but when it comes to perhaps scrapping domestic flights, at least from Glasgow and Edinburgh, that maybe makes it harder. You know, we're not going to have a 3-hour, 40-minute journey anymore because your government, your colleagues in Westminster, have decided to scrap that northern leg, and that cuts off Scotland at its legs in terms of fast rail south.
Yeah, I accept that, but there are other infrastructure problems as well. And SNP's had very considerable problems with the A9. We know about the delays in that infrastructure project, which I would argue is a very substantial infrastructure project that Scotland desperately needs. Not just in terms of the north-south travel, but in terms of ensuring that our rural communities are much better served. So it's not just a case of HS2 being a problem. There are lots of other infrastructure difficulties as well.
Well, let's turn to Michael Mara from the Scottish Labour Party. Michael Mara, what are your parties saying about HS2? We've heard from senior shadow cabinet figures who seem perhaps a little vague about what you as a government might do if Sir Keir Starmer was in number 10.
Well, there's a huge opportunity cost for Scotland involved, and it's frankly having two governments that are tired and utterly inept and unable to deliver against the plans that they've had in place for years. In this case of HS2, for well over a decade. We've already covered the issues of ferries and the inability. You know, we can add the A9 to that list in terms of the infrastructure projects that are not being delivered across Scotland. So we do have, at the moment, two governments that are completely failing to invest in growth and growing the economy. That's why Scotland's economy has been stagnant for over a decade.
So my question to you, Michael Mara, is let's be definitive here. Our Labour say they will resurrect that northern leg of HS2.
Yeah, Labour has been absolutely clear in terms of when we come to the next election, we will look at what the inheritance is and we'll make decisions on that basis. That's what the British public expect. We want a public purse that is actually well run, not what we've got from either government at the moment. So we'll look at the state of that project when we hopefully
take power and the opportunity. Why can't you commit now, Michael Mara?
Because of this huge scale of the uncertainty in the public finances bequeathed by this Tory government and Liz Truss's disastrous budget that's left inflation running at sky-high levels. We have to look at the situation of the public finances when we come into power. That's what we're not going to get ourselves in the position where the Tories have and the SNP have, making promises that they can't deliver. We'll look at that project when we come to government if we have the chance to serve, and we'll make sure we can deliver what we promise.
But I don't quite understand your position, because the Prime Minister is looking at this now. He's saying there's not enough money for this. Let's look at doing this differently in other ways. Should Labour not just be saying that as well? Should you not be able to commit in some way? You know what the figures are.
Well, to be frank, we don't know what the figures are. We are potentially, well over a year away from another general election, so we don't know what we're going to be bequeathed in the public finances generally. So we have to make sure that we can afford what we can deliver. I think people have had enough, frankly, of this situation, including business internationally, people wanting to invest in this country, of uncertainty. A Labour government will deliver what it says it delivers. We have to move away from the situation of these two governments who can't deliver the projects that they say they're going to. So Labour are going to make sure that we can get this right. Yes, with added competence on top, frankly, of the public financial situation, but we'll make that decision when we get the figures in front of us.
Well, Michael Mara from Scottish Labour, Liz Smith from the Scottish Conservatives, and Ben McPherson from the SNP. Thank you all very much for joining me. Right, we'll return to Holyrood in just a moment, but first of all, let's catch up with Phil Sim once again. And Phil, I suppose the cancelling of that northern leg of HS2, is that perhaps a gift for the SNP? Because whenever the ferries are indeed now brought up, Hamza Yousaf can mention HS2.
Yeah, and as Ben McPherson was saying as well, they can point to successes, things like the Queensferry crossing, but when we're going into a general election, which seems to be gearing up to be a bit of a fight, essentially, yes, it gives them something they can sling back at them too. And it makes it awkward for the other parties because, the Conservative MSPs have had to defend 3 different Prime Ministers in the last year and a bit, and now they've had to defend slightly different positions under the same Prime Minister. And there have been some uncomfortable scenes, I think, for some of them at that conference, having to defend some of the things being said on the main stage, things about, the meat tax and 50-minute cities and so on. But, that is politics. These are parties that are sailing towards a general election. election. The MSPs, like the MPs, are kind of lashed to the mast heading into the storm of this election. And yeah, a bit of awkwardness for Labour there too, in a way. Their whole position that they need to look fiscally responsible ahead of the general election, but also they need to display a bit of vision. They need to tell people what it is they are for. And I suppose that's probably what we're expecting more of from Keir Starmer at the Labour conference this weekend.
Indeed, and we might see some of that, but I suppose there will come a time, and it is time limited, when Labour maybe might have to start nailing colours to the mast. We don't know when that is because we don't know when a general election might be.
No, it'll all come in the manifesto, I suppose. But yeah, there's been a lot of speculation through the Tory conference about when the next election will be. It has to be held by January 2025, which feels a very long time away yet, the way politics has been progressing. There have been a lot of speculation it'll be around about this time next year. Jeremy Hunt has suggested something similar, but some people equally have said, well, these big new policies coming out, maybe this is a government gearing up for an election. Maybe they're about to hit the road and actually call an earlier election, maybe even next spring. So, I mean, we'll wait and see. It is ultimately down to the government when they decide to hold that election, but it's certainly clear that all of the parties are kind of road testing their messages. They are building up to those manifesto launches we'll see in due course, and they are getting election ready, and it is all about, you know, it's all about the slogans, it's all about the big costed policies. Yeah, and I think we're going to see, pretty much that's all we're going to see, I imagine, in the coming year.
And Phil, of course, when it comes to net zero promises on behalf of all the parties, I mentioned that to Liz Smith as well, you know, the cancelling of domestic flights in the UK, a bit problematic in a sense.
Yeah, and you know, I think Rishi Sunak's net zero announcement last week kind of kicked this off in a way, this whole debate about what the future of the country is going to look at. And yeah, that is ultimate. That's election fodder. This is where you really get to see the measure of political parties by the priorities they have and the policies they choose, and that is what people ultimately will have a choice on in that general election.
Phil, thanks very much. Well, let's go back to Holyrood now and speak to a couple more political guests. We have Ariane Burgess from the Scottish Green Party and Alex Coe-Hamilton, the leader of the Scottish Liberal Democrats. Good afternoon to both of you. Thank you very much for joining me. First of all, to you, Ms Burgess, just your reaction actually in the cancelling of the northern leg of HS2. You must be pretty disappointed, I imagine.
Well, I haven't heard the Prime Minister's speech, but I would say that any investment away from rail is disappointing. It's quite normal for countries all across the world to have high-speed rail. And I think in Scotland what we're doing, just this week we started the removal of the peak fares trial period for 6 months, and I think that is the direction we should be going in, supporting people to get on trains and also sort out our infrastructure.
A couple of reasons the Prime Minister gave was the cost of the project. It was just costing so much money for what they were actually getting. And he was mentioning that pandemic travel, post-pandemic travel, had also changed as well. You were talking about wanting to get people on trains, but maybe people are not getting on trains. The way that people do business has ultimately changed.
Well, certainly my experience commuting from the north to Edinburgh every week, I see plenty of people on trains and actually carriages that are overflowing with people. So I think we need to really support that direction and improve our infrastructure and put more investment in rail.
And so how do you view now the future of high-speed rail in the United Kingdom? Do you think a Labour government might revitalise that link, might resurrect it? Do you think there is ever a chance of high-speed rail from Scotland down south in the next 50 years, even a high-speed rail connection between Glasgow and Edinburgh?
Well, of course, I would love to see high-speed rail in Scotland, but it's not for me to comment on Labour policy.
OK, well, Alex Coe-Hamilton from the Scottish Liberal Democrats. What did you make of that?
Well, it was a managerial speech from a Prime Minister who is overseeing a process of managed decline, not just for his own political party, but for the country at large. It's quite astonishing to see a Prime Minister giving his first conference address to a UK Conservative Party conference and announce something he's not going to do rather than what he's going to do. I think it will certainly undermine the chances of his MPs in the Red Wall in those northern seats, and it gives a signal, I think, that he is turning away from commitments to net zero, to getting people off the road, out of cars, and onto active travel like high-speed rail infrastructure.
But perhaps is the Prime Minister not being a pragmatist? And he did say, of course, that costs on HS2 had indeed ballooned, and of course famously ballooning under the Conservative Lib Dem coalition government from 2010 to 2015.
Well, I think that the actual lion's share of this has happened since we left office. And if you look at it, I think it speaks to the fact that the Conservative government, like the Scottish National Party and their Green Coalition partners, are struggling to deliver infrastructure problems. What do I mean by that? Well, they're looking at cost plus contracts, whereby it will be costs plus 15%. It will be the commercial rate that they're offering to contractors. It's then in the interest of those contractors to see those costs increase because their profit margins increase. That's why this is skyrocketed out of control. And we only need to look to the ships on the Clyde, for which the passenger ferries being built on the Clyde, for which we had one of them ostensibly launched 6 years ago, which is yet still under construction, because every bit of that launch was fake. It was enough to make Kim Jong-un blush, and speaks to the fact that this government is woefully incapable. Both governments are woefully incapable of delivering huge infrastructure projects, and there's a human cost beneath that.
And just finally and briefly, Alex Hamilton, we will be getting the so-called Barnett consequentials, extra money for Scotland coming north because of the new Northern Network. You must welcome those billions of pounds, though.
Oh, absolutely. And I want to see them used to be invested in rail travel, getting people out of the cars. And it was the Liberal Democrats that were first to talk about off-peak travel, well, reducing peak fares. And also, not only that, but actually actively getting people into trains by giving them those discounted rail cards so that everyone can enjoy discounted travel, make sure that, it becomes a preferred transportation of choice. Let's remember, we are seeing a huge existential threat to our way of life in the climate emergency.
Right.
And one of the biggest producers of CO2 of this is domestic travel. So yes, absolutely, let's invest that in green travel and getting people out of cars.
Well, Alex Hamilton from the Scottish Liberal Democrats and Ariane Burgess from the Scottish Greens, thanks both very much for joining me. Good to see you both.
Thank you.
Right, it's the last full day of campaigning in Rutherglen and Hamilton West before the polls open tomorrow. It's a by-election that's been getting a lot of attention, and Phil is still with me here. Phil, this is essentially a big test for the parties, isn't it?
It is, and as I say, it's really grabbed a lot of the attention, including at Holyrood. I think you've seen a lot of MSPs, frankly, have been off campaigning in the seat. I think Jackie Baillie effectively lives there now. But you do see MSPs tweeting these selfies of themselves out knocking on doors in Rutherglen. And also even the debates being held at Parliament. Today, the government's holding a debate about the two-child cap, which is one of their favourite lines for battering Labour with, the fact that they haven't committed to getting rid of the two-child cap and benefits if they were to form a government. Equally, Anna Sarwar tends to use his questions at FMQ now effectively as stump speeches ahead of any general election, and indeed this by-election. So I think we've seen the SNP and Labour in particular really going at it over this by-election, and there are of course 14 candidates in the by-election, and we can sing it together. There is a full list of candidates on the BBC News website, but it's a key test for those two parties in particular, because this is a seat which has bounced back and forth between them. I think at the last 4 elections now, it's gone red then yellow, red, yellow, and yeah, it's a key test of whether this resurgence Scottish Labour have had in the opinion polls is actually real. Does it translate into actual polls, actual votes in a ballot box? And of course, a key test too for Humza Yousaf is his first electoral test as the leader of the SNP. So yeah, it's really a contest that I imagine both of those parties are looking at and think they don't want to lose.
And it's funny in a way, Phil, because it feels like this contest has been running for years almost, since Margaret Ferrier broke those COVID rules in 2020.
Yes, officially I think it's been a 5 or 6 week campaign, but it has been going on for months and months and months. I think Keir Starmer made his first appearance there, March or April of this year. It's been going on a long time, and it's an interesting one because a by-election is such a spotlight contest. It's so narrowed in on one seat, and it won't be like that in a general election. We know it will be much more of a big national campaign, so maybe you can't take the result entirely as a bellwether of what would happen in a general election. It is picked out in that way, but it's going to be really important, I think, for whoever wins this by-election will feel they have momentum going into that bigger contest, and it'll help them build their political arguments ahead of the key contest next year.
OK, Phil, thank you very much for that, and thank you for all your contributions here in the studio today. Right, we will have continuing coverage of that by-election, and as Phil mentioned, a list of all the candidates standing in that by-election are available on the BBC Scotland News website. But that's all we have time for today on Politics Scotland. Join Kirsten Campbell for our live coverage of First Minister's Questions tomorrow from noon, but from all of us here in the studio, thanks for being with us. Bye-bye for now.